Hi, welcome to SCDM's AI and eSource podcast series. My name is Nechama Katan, and I'm a member of the eSource Implementation Consortium. The consortium's mission is to advance the adoption of eSource in clinical research. The use of artificial intelligence in many forms, whether generative AI, agentic AI, which is an extra case of generative AI, machine learning, natural language processing, large language models, or GPT, has the potential to increase eSource adoption through the most effective implementation processes, documentation, training, validation, etc. This podcast series will talk with folks using AI in eSource for multiple clinical research perspectives, sites, sponsors, technology, and vendors. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Brian Barnes, who is representing a sponsor perspective. Brian brings over 20 years of experience in clinical research and pharmaceutical development with deep expertise in risk-based monitoring, RBQM, ICH E6R3 implementation, and operational excellence. In his current role, he leads strategies that integrate proportionate risk management, centralized monitoring, and data-driven oversight to enhance trial quality and efficiency. Ryan is focused on practical, scalable approaches and is particularly interested in how innovation in AI-enabled solutions can support regulatory compliance and strengthen operational quality across global clinical development teams. So welcome, Brian. Before we get started, though, I want to give a quick couple disclaimers. So, the quick SCDM disclaimers before we get started. This podcast is provided by the Society of Clinical Data Management, SCDM, eSource Implementation Consortium. It is intended for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal, regulatory, or professional advice. SCDM and the speakers are not responsible for any of the actions taken based on the information provided. Users are advised to consult with appropriate professionals for specific advice tailored to their individual circumstances. The opinions expressed are attributed to the speakers only and not their respective employers. Let's get started. Brian, just want to welcome you. How are
Thank you
you?
for having me. Yeah, really excited to join today. I think AI and clinical operations is, as it is in I think our general world today, a very interesting dynamic space, which I think kind of contributes to the complexity, but also the interest and opportunity for future success. So excited to have a conversation today. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So let's just dive in first with what is AI, and a really quick. We could spend the entire time talking about what is AI, but so let's just do this really quickly, right? So, AI is an acronym that stands for artificial intelligence. It's generally means the application of computer models to make what looks like intelligent decisions. So, some type of computer models, machine learning, prediction models, or statistical models. ChatGPT's LLMs are token predictions, where you identify what is the most likely next token or next word that would be used. And that is a technology we've all become very familiar with even things as simple as your phone guessing the next word you're putting in when you're sending a text chat, right? So that's AI. We see it in our everyday life, but let's start to think about what areas of eSource do you focus on most, and where are you kind of using AI within your eSource space?
hmm I think it's a great question. I think this is kind of, and I know we can have the conversation about the definition of AI from and a number of different lenses. And I think for me, maybe there's kind of the classic technology implementation of what we see. So yes, I think those are great. And I think the other piece that we're starting to see a little bit, and I've seen conversations about this in industry and conferences and so forth, is kind of how AI is being used in clinical development. And so I think that definition is complementary to what we're typically seeing. And I think the other interesting part that I'm seeing, and I think it's most important for us today to actually kind of date when we're having this conversation. So, I'll kind of say this is January of 26 because I think we can talk more about it today. The speed of innovation and the speed of change is something that we haven't seen before. So the conversations that we're having today could be obsolete next week, and I think that's part of the complexity that we have to work in. So I think in general, yes, I agree with kind of the general definition. As we start to get closer into clinical development and kind of a regulated space, I think that definition starts to get grayer. So for us right now, when I look at the definition of AI, I'm also looking at kind of how regulators are thinking about it. So for us today, I would say I'm aware, right? And definitely open to your thoughts if you've seen others. There's kind of three general regulatory perspectives that we're seeing. We have the US FDA that came out in January of last year. I think it was 25. And now just recently in 26, we've seen a principles document from US FDA and EMA, which is interesting. We can talk more about that today. And also MHRA just included in their dossier requirements an AI piece. So what's interesting to me is that the definitions of AI are slightly different even between the regulators. So I can expect that all to kind of come as we kind of learn and develop as an industry of what that is. So yes, I definitely agree with your perspective and broad definition of AI. We can talk about a little bit more of the complexity, but maybe the last piece to how I'm using it today. And I think for me, where my interest is landing more coming from a clinical operations perspective, and this is where I love joining individuals like yourself, kind of from a data lens, is kind of combining those two, where I think there's been that thought that when we're talking about AI, it needs to be data generation or kind of those pieces. So yes, I think that is, and I think there's a lot of great technologies that do that. But I think there's also another side of AI in terms of change management, change adoption, efficiency that FDA talks about that I think we haven't quite tapped into yet. So happy to kind of explore some of those pieces and talk to giving examples of those today. But I think there's a very gray space, which is kind of interesting for us to talk about.
Which is interesting. So, just for the listeners, there will be a links to all of those documents in the podcast notes and comments. So, let's go and talk about. I find it's complicated ideas are easier to discuss if you have a firm example. So, can you share with us kind of an eSource project within the RBQM space where you're using AI currently? Like maybe we can walk through this whole process from start to end of what is the problem, what is the technology, how are you using it, what is the workflow, and kind of what are the challenges you're facing in a very small sliver of one of your use cases, because I think that will help us ground this conversation.
Yeah, I think that's great. So for me, I think, and this is the piece that for me, and just to kind of date, I've been working and using AI for me in my day job. So my day job is risk assessment, and that's kind of where my passion in risk-based quality management comes from. And for me in AI, and you'll see in those guidance principles, and especially with R3, risk proportionality and risk assessment is heavily noted, which I thought was fantastic for a number of different reasons. So for me, what started to kind of unlock the moment, and as I work within kind of the change management lens, and my interest is, and right now I sit within a process development part of the business. And how are we thinking about SOPs and process development to do these types of AI? But for me, was the simple activity is performing a risk assessment. So within industry, we've been seeing ever since R2 the idea of a risk assessment driving protocol development, and I think as an industry, we've struggled to deliver that, unfortunately, which has kind of been something I've scratched my head on for a number of years. Is literally 15 years ago, we talked about this idea, but why haven't we been able to deliver? And I think there's been a couple of different reasons for that. But I think AI has been able to unlock a couple of those. And so for me, just doing risk assessments was a piece. And as I talk internally, and when people start working with AI, they get the, oh my I didn't know it could do this. And that's when it started to unlock for me and started to kind of see the different use cases. So for me, one of the pain points that we have within industry is getting feedback, getting perspectives, and really taking a cognitive risk-based thought approach to our development. And there's a number of different reasons why we struggle with that, right? I know everybody has a lot of different deliverables that they're working towards. So it's hard for people to bring a full thought to the risk assessment. Unfortunately, it's kind of reality. So as I was facilitating risk assessments, I started to say, well, what were some of the pain points that I was experiencing, right? It's just getting different perspectives, getting different lenses, and kind of the continuity. So as I started to see that with the early large language models, copilots, specifically, and we can talk about which models or why we choose some over the other, but maybe that's a different conversation. But I could start simulating different perspectives. So, for example, when I'm doing risk assessments, I need to get my medics to give me some perspective. I need my biostats to give me perspectives. I need my clinical operations. And to get all of those stakeholders in one location or even one time point and get their attention and their focus is very difficult from a scheduling standpoint. And then number two, it's very costly. I mean, these are a lot of kind of resource heavy individuals. And then I started to look at the capabilities that AI brought. Basic prompts, I could simulate anybody I wanted to be, right? And this is kind of early large language models. Is I could say, hey, I'm a biostatistician with 20 years of experience. Here's things that are important to me. Here's my protocol. Here's some of the risks. Like, open up my eyes to what do I need to think about. So that was kind of the first use case that I started to
So,
work through is risk assessments and helping to facilitate
yeah,
those.
I'm going to interrupt you just for
Yeah,
two quick comments here. One is, and we had this conversation before we started this recording. Is this really eSource? And the answer is yes, it is, because you're eSourcing now. You're using AI to create an eSource risk assessment. So that's the first question, a comment. The second comment I'm going to make is the elephant in the room is, but wait, can you trust AI? And I'm going to ask, when you say, okay, and are you just replacing people, right, with this? And the answer is, I think, maybe we can talk a little bit more about how do you um, use the protocol, these kind of initial conversations, because you're using them as straw men, I understand, where you build out, hey, here's what we think the risks are. Then you go to an actual real life statistician for confirmation and human in the loop, correct?
correct. Yeah.
You're not you're not
Well,
writing your risk assessments off in your little office while watching the snowfall by yourself,
yeah,
right?
yeah, that's a great point, right? And so we've put some different models, and I think we now as an industry we have a couple of papers that are getting ready to be kind of published on this to kind of talk about that. But you're exactly right. I think a lot of people when they say, "Oh, is AI going to drive your risk assessment?" I don't just plug it in and take what it gives and we go on our merry way. No, that's not it. And so one of the big pieces that I talk about internally and as we talk about adoption of AI is how do you bring an augmented approach? And I want to be very specific. So I think the first, when I look at AI, one of the questions I ask, and to me, this is still kind of filling out, again, this is January of 26, is like, to me, there's two different lenses that are starting to come that regulators. So you kind of have the validation and the data generated for regulatory submission side of that lens, which is great. FDA talks about that in their paper. But then there's this other side that's coming out, right? And I think that's where it's the human in the loop. And so to get to your point, and I think that maybe this is another point that I'll turn back to you is I think probably in 2025 one of the biggest concerns I heard was people are like, oh, this is going to take my job, this is going to do that. I actually have heard that to start to dwindle down, to be honest. I think as people are starting to engage with it more in their real lives, they're realizing, maybe there's some opportunity here. So I think the other part that I bring to that is, and this is where I think we're at a distinct advantage where we are as an industry is there's subject matter expertise that's required. So when we're talking about an augmented versus an automated approach, so what I'm going to speak to is an augmented approach, which drives human in the loop, which is leveraging the expertise and actually exponentially helping the person that has that knowledge to perform better, right? So that's exactly what I'm talking about, is the human in the loop. And when we talk about the FDA and EMA guidance, the number one first principle they come with, which to me is how we have to start to develop SOPs and processes, is a human centric by design. So where is the human in the loop? How are we leveraging that expertise? And when you get that augmented approach is when you start to see the 3-10x efficiency gains happening. So great distinction of with the risk assessment is it's not a one and done exercise. It's an iterative conversation. And that's actually why I like, and we can talk a little bit more about AI design and what the UI
Mhm.
interfaces look like, but it's a chat, right? It's a chat, it's a conversation. It's not a Google search where I search and it gives me a result and I move on. It's a conversation, it's a chat. So I'll kind of pause there, but yes, that's a great distinction that I think we have to call out is I'm a very big proponent of an augmented AI
Yep.
approach.
And the augmented approach is not unique to pharmaceuticals. All of the studies have shown that smart, a reasonable chess player and a reasonable set of chess programs will actually beat out a chess master. Um, so it's using the tools. It's using it as a tool, just like you would use a calculator or something else as a tool. Okay, so
And I kind of want to maybe talk a little bit about that, right? Sorry to this is a
yeah,
great conversation.
please, yeah.
I think the other part is when we're talking about it as a tool, I think this kind of bridges into the risk assessment side, right? And I think this is where we're starting to see those regulatory conversations happening is a risk-based approach. So, like every tool, we need to have a risk assessment on impact. And so I actually just was thinking about a great historical lens to kind of date back, especially to the EDC world, but the world of double data entry. When we used to have paper case books, right, and we used to do double data entry, that was a risk mitigation activity, right? So we build SOPs to do that. And going back to eSource is kind of where I started to think about this. Is that was a risk mitigation. So with AI, a lot of those same flavors hold consistent today, right? And so going back to your idea of maybe people talking about risk assessments and the fear, and I'm just going to use the hallucination, we can talk more about that, is the fear of hallucinations is how do you mitigate that risk, right? That is a risk. And that's why I like the principles is a risk-based approach. I'm not going to take a one-size-fits-all approach to my AI adoption. There needs to be a risk assessment, risk proportionality. So based on the potential impact of that data, will determine what type of double data entry confirmation do I need to do. So do I use multiple models, right? Do I need multiple human in the loops to do that, right? I think that's part of the system design and process development that's interesting to me. So going back to your eSource idea is I think a risk-based decision-making process of where is this data going and what is the potential impact of the data has to be documented, has to be decided, and has to be managed as part of that AI implementation path.
Yeah, and just to kind of follow up on that, I don't know where you're at in your particular journey, but if you think about reading a protocol, for example, there's ways to make that protocol more e-source, even if it wasn't written in an electronic system. Um, and that then allows you can remove some of the hallucination risk by chunking the protocol to a standard, which then makes it easier to verify the data on the other side, right? There's those types of additional steps and tools that can be put in place. So you've given us an example of where you use generative AI tools to write risk protocols, and in particular to get that framing of, okay, what would a statistician view this protocol? How would a clinician view this protocol? How would a nurse at a site view this protocol? In terms of risks. What are some of the challenges you've had in getting people to adopt this technology or to implement it, um, or to even be allowed to use it in your environment? I'm sure there's
Yeah.
people listening to this saying, "Whoa, I would never be allowed to do this." Um, so, what
And
are
that's
kind of the technical challenges and the organizational challenges, and then kind of some of the regulatory challenges in
mhm.
doing this?
And this is the part that's really interesting to me, right? And this is kind of where I see a lot of opportunity and makes me excited in the future are these challenges. And so I think the first one that I see, um, is AI adoption isn't typical change management. And when I say typical change management, everyone's like, oh, we have a new technology coming in. We'll take like an ad car change management approach, right? This will be a great way that we deliver. So if you look at maybe EDC or CTMS or some of those historic ways, that's not going to work for AI.
And can
And
you
I think
explain ADCAR very quickly for people who might not be familiar with it?
AdCar is, for those that may not be familiar, is kind of a typical kind of change management organization where or not organization, but approach where you're kind of taking a higher level and give people training and tools and kind of filter it down by giving them, exposure to that. And I think from a general change management is successful. Where I see AI, and at least in my experiences, AI not kind of following that model, which is good and bad. First and foremost is the speed of change. And I think, at least in my career, I haven't experienced a technology that has developed and evolved as quickly as AI is. And that's kind of where I think it's important for us to date the conversation that we're having today. And as I do education with my internal organization, the sessions that I did on number one, just basic, we'll call it Copilot. That's probably the one I think you asked that question about security. So yes, security is paramount, right? And that's where having good technology security is important. So let's just kind of focus on that, or say that focus security is important. We'll focus on kind of operationalizing it. But even from just the UI interface of Copilot, it changes by the week. And so when I put together a training, or how we've historically put together an EDC training module, it's a validated system. And until you adopt the next change, it will be the same, right? So I can train people and they know where to click, they know the processes. That's not the case for AI. It will consistently evolve and change, which is at the same time super scary, but at the same time very powerful, where the AI today is the worst that it will be tomorrow. And ever since then, it's going to get better. So when everyone's like, hey, can't quite do what I needed to do, oh, don't worry, it'll probably be next week. So how do you build the speed of change into your processes? And how do you develop an organizational framework? And then how do you support and embrace that speed of change? So anyway, that's a whole different thing. So I think it's one of the biggest challenges of the speed of change. How do you train an organization and even build an organization to support it? I think that's the biggest one. So as I work with teams, and as I work with organizational change management, how do you start to build around that speed of change? I think that's the biggest challenge and opportunity.
So I think it's interesting to me because when I think about the change from E6R2 to R3, I think of it as going from checkboxes to judgment, right? And if you think about exactly that training methodology you've done, right? How many of us have seen those PowerPoint trainings with 130 slides of click here, click there, click here, click there, right? And now you have to think about, okay, what questions are you asking AI? How are you responding to the answers that it's giving you? How are you verifying the information? How are you adapting the question, right? So you're literally going from the checkbox to the judgment with the R2 to R3. And so this is a nice analogy for me. Um, what would you say the top three challenges you have faced in implementing AI within your eSource workflow? So, in this case, I'm going to kind of preface this question a little bit by saying you've clearly defined an eSource workflow by putting AI into a workflow that typically hasn't been considered eSource. Risk assessment hasn't typically been considered eSource in the past, but Brian, you've created a an example of that. And then when you think about the challenges, I had a conversation with someone else recently, and how do you get people to adopt, right? Is maybe one of the biggest challenges, and get over the fear of it. Um, so, what have you found to be useful, or what are those challenges, and how have you kind of overcome them?
Let me ask a little clarifying question for you, because I think your eSource one is interesting. As you guys go through the podcast series, do you define AI as eSource?
So that's right. eSource is defined generally as electronic processes. I'm gonna right that are being
Hmm.
used to augment clinical trials. That's my personal definition, not necessarily eSource Consortium. I don't have that written out, right? But that if we think about it in the most broad, holistic sense, I think of eSource as being where do we bring in electronic computer aided ways of doing our work, right? The classic example is paper to EDC, paper consent to e-consent. This would be paper risk assessment to e-risk assessment. And what in my mind makes it e-risk is not the fact that I'm using Word or Excel, because I think of those as paper-ish, but that I've got an electronic process, a computer-driven process, in which case AI, I've talked myself around in a circle, Brian, in which case AI gives you the ability to say an e-risk assessment.
So would it be a fair assumption if I'm understanding how you're thinking about it, right? And again, this is not representative of our organizations, right? Then I'm understanding maybe that would you agree with AI as eSource, right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so
So the reason I'm
AI is an e-source is a tool under which you can implement eSource or a way to implement eSource.
okay. The
So if I
reason I
think of
oh yeah.
protocol chunking, right? So protocol chunking would be a way to take a paper protocol and make it into a protocol put into a standard, for example.
Okay. The reason I'm asking, and this is kind of one of my kind of strong passions in moving forward, is how do you adopt an AI first mindset? How do we as a clinical development industry adopt an AI first mindset? And to me, there's a number of different reasons why I think we have to, and a number of different reasons that I think we have no choice. We will, and that's kind of one of my other key takeaways is ignoring is not going to make it go away. And so I think as we take an AI first mindset, we should be doing all of our day-to-day activities in an augmented AI approach. And for those that and this is part of that challenge question that you brought up is how do you start developing that skill set, right? So it isn't just and again, I think I don't want to overly generalize how industry is, but it's not just having a technology or some type of technology application that's going to help with doing some of the work. No, it's how are we doing our day-to-day work. Examples that I gave is the risk assessment, but I can go by a question that I challenge a lot is rather than saying what can we use AI for is I want you to tell me why I cannot use AI for this, right? Why can I not use an augmented AI approach for any task that you're doing throughout the day? And so that's kind of where I was asking your question of is AI eSource is because I think that line of what are we using? And I think this is where the regulatory definitions are gray. They kind of use the preface of a regulatory decision. That's really gray because I bring it into my risk assessments. I bring it into the way that I'm looking at queries. I bring it into my meeting minutes. I bring it in every part of my day has some component that I'm referencing an AI model, right? And so, am I out of the loop? No, like I am now the driver of that, and it's my 20 plus years of experience that is telling it, yes, that's we're on the right page, or no, wait, that's not quite the way we were thinking about it. Let's reframe that. So that's that conversation. So anyway, long-winded maybe response to your question is I think everything will actually be eSource and AI, but then where is that taking us? That's another interesting conversation.
Well, and then you have the added question of really should everything be AI or there should be situations, let's say basic math computation does not need a generative AI tool to do 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? It's a very, very expensive way to do it, right? Sometimes you actually just want a manual screwdriver and not, a 20-pound, impact driver. Um,
But I
and
think maybe
and
on,
it,
on that point, I agree. I agree with that. And this is where the risk-based approach comes in, right? It's risk proportionality where I'm not going to take the same tool to the job. but I need to be able to explain in an inspection, in my opinion, this is where
Why you
it intersects with R3, why I made the decisions to use and accept the different components that I did, right? And I think
Mhm.
that's where risk
Yep.
proportionality, and we see that in the flavor of these principles come out, is it has to be risk based, and how are we documenting those decisions? So I completely agree with you, is picking the right tool for the job.
Picking the right tool for the job and it given the right situation that that tool's in right now. So let's just a couple quick, really quick, fast questions to wrap up. Looking ahead, what are you the most excited about, and what are you the most scared about?
I think for me, the exciting is, I feel like even over the last 2 years, 3 years, we are achieving deliverables and areas within, and maybe specifically risk-based quality management, but I think clinical development, that we have not been able to achieve in my career lifetime, right? And so that makes me excited. Where for me, we can bring those compounds to the market quicker for the patients and the patient centricity that we've talked about. I think now we're able to operationalize those and drive efficiency. So I think that is the thing that makes me most excited. The thing that makes me most fearful is, like any tool, if it's not used correctly, it can bring harm. So how do we train our knowledge workers today to be able to embrace those tools and use them appropriately in a fit for purpose way? What does that look like? And maybe that closes is um, kind of um, my last piece is, putting your head in the sand isn't going to make it go away. It's not going away. It is here to stay. And that's kind of the piece that I challenge organizations with is, you have to move forward. And if you don't, you will be left behind. I think we've been able to demonstrate in the last 2 years that you will be left behind if you're not embracing this. So I think that's both exciting, scary, and powerful at the same time. Yeah.
And when we're talking about tools like Copilot, we didn't get into detail about how you're using Copilot. People are using those tools, even if they're not stating it. So we'd better train them on how to use them correctly.
Exactly. And I think as people start to adopt it in their outside life, goes back to security. You don't want your data in the wrong thing. So yeah, people will use the tools. So that's where I definitely come from, the mindset of give them the proper tools to use, because they will be using them.
So what's the one piece of advice to someone who's like, okay, I'm going to go do this? Where should they start?
I think the best thing, and that's a great way to end, is trial. And I think that's the biggest piece for me, is there is no right or wrong answer with AI. It's just doing it. And I think that is the biggest success metric, is attempts, shots on goal. When you get in there and you try, even if you fail and you don't get an output, you learned a ton. And so that is, as I'm working through change management in our organization, it's like, I just want to see you use it. Talk to me about what worked good, what didn't work, and we'll problem solve that together. But I want to see shots on goal. So that is the biggest thing, is you're not going to be perfect. Get in there, play around, and then let's talk about what happened. And then that's the way I think we're all going to move forward quickly.
Great. And you're opening yourself up to anyone who wants to reach out to you on LinkedIn, can go ahead and jump you a
100%. Yeah,
note.
exactly. I think
Great.
LinkedIn, I love the conversations, and excited to hear how other people are thinking about it as well.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, Brian. I think this was really great to hear possibly what some people think of as a different example of eSource and AI and how your journey has gone. And for everyone else, please join us on Spotify for additional podcast episodes on AI and eSource. And thank you for listening.
Thank you again for having me.
Thank you.